So it doesn't look like anyone from the public is here, so we'll jump into attendance. So is Lloyd here? I think I saw him. Okay, Patrick?
I am here.
Okay. Ajit? Jan?
Yep.
Rachel? No. Jen?
Yep. I'm here.
Linda?
I'm here.
Peter?
Just call my name. I am here.
It rotates who I can see on the screen, so it's helpful. Ram?
Present.
Trina? I don't think so. Susan? No. Rob?
Present.
Maura?
Here.
Okay, I think that's everybody. Awesome. Thank you. So I will share my screen, which is something I could have done initially. Oh, and Lloyd is here. Can you see the PowerPoint?
I can.
Okay. So we've done public comment and attendance. I'm gonna toss it over to Scott for the encryption part of this meeting.
All right, I'll talk through it. And then I don't know, Katie, if you want to put it in presentation mode, or I'm not sure what the.
Sure. Does that work?
That's a little better, yeah. Not that these are the most exciting slides. So we had, I think, 3 topics for today. One of the reasons we kind of asked for a meeting off the regular cycle was for exactly the next topic, was talking through a possible change to the encryption standards for the data transmittal. And this is it's a good topic, I thought, for a couple of reasons. One, the topic itself is important, but it's a good illustration for 2 different things. We'll look through in a second, just sort of the role for the data governing board, and then the next topic on the voting procedures. Like, this is an example. We thought of something where data governing board may or may not like need to make a decision, and it's a good way of thinking about, like, all right, what are the kinds of decisions that this board is tasked with, and how do we want to make decisions sort of on these kinds of examples. So this is a good example, and it's something, you know, that actually sort of needs some attention, and it had come up in a meeting that didn't have, you know, everybody from this group. And so we thought, okay, well, we need to have like this topic come back to the whole data governing board, because I think some people were aware of it and some people were not. And, you know, I think we have identified sort of a proposed change to the encryption that we're using for the data transmittal, which I think is good news, but we have to talk about it with the whole board, not just whoever happened to be in that meeting a few weeks ago. So I'll talk, and we have, I know we have Liam from Department of Labor and John Mokler from DS Best, and I think both of you, if you want to introduce yourselves in a sec, we'll go into the technical part of this in a second. We have resident experts who can go through some of this in a little better detail than me, but I'll kind of describe it. So the first part, this is just a reason for having this discussion is, or kind of like, why are we discussing this topic today? So this is language on the role for the data governing board. This is from the draft new legal agreements. I think, you know, some of the wording and the details are a little different than the current legal agreements, but I think the sentiment is not wildly different. So this is just sort of the role for the data governing board, and I flagged some of the things where, you know, this is the kind of topic that that we, you know, are tasked with discussing. So establishing policies or enforcing and establishing policies for cross-agency data management, not limited to data privacy, confidentiality, and security, providing oversight for the technical implementation of the process, ensuring availability, privacy, confidentiality, and security of data shared through the data integration hub, so Department of Labor, and then some of the more specific duties and responsibilities are evaluating quality of the technical process, and then developing and recommending policies and procedures that need to be created or improved. So I think this discussion probably falls into the latter, where this is something where there's a policy and a procedure, there's something we're doing now, and we're, you know, coming forward with a recommendation to improve that within the domain of data privacy, confidentiality, and security. So just this is sort of the rationale, like here's why we're having this discussion today, so that you're all aware of, sort of the details of this, how this operates, the potential changes that we might be making to how some of these things are implemented in the system, and you have the opportunity to, evaluate and sort of determine how you want to proceed on that. So does that all make sense? Just for the, here's why we're having a discussion, not least of which is the topic is important, but just to frame why this topic is coming up here.
It does make sense.
Yep, makes sense.
All right. Next slide. I'm going to talk through the current status, and then John, Liam, anyone else who understands this better, please stop and correct me at whatever point I get this wrong. But this is the sort of current status. So, today at this moment, here's how data transmittal is implemented for the P20 WIN system. And this, really applies to everything that happens for P20 WIN. So the transmittal of data, meaning sort of like the sending of data, whether it's in a file or a database or however it's formatted, the sending of data from one point to another, we're using the Axway secure transport application. So I think colloquially we call it SFTP, but this is the actual application that's used to facilitate the data transmittal. It covers basically all the transfers that are used for P20 WIN. We use the same tool for every data set, regardless of the data set, whether it's the analytic data, the matching data, the resultant data. The same tool is used in all cases. It's used for the transfers from the participating agencies to Department of Labor. It's used for transfers to the data recipients. It's used for, possibly transfers between, the data, between participating agencies, if you're using it in the analysis phase. So this, I put an asterisk because my understanding is once in a while there's been an exception and we'll use someone else's SFTP-like tool. But the sort of default mode for the system is that every data set that is transferred is using this application for the transfer, and it applies to any transfer between the sort of three parties, the participating agencies, Department of Labor, and the data recipient. So Department of Labor is the user, the customer for Axway Secured Transport, but DSBest provides sort of primary support for the application. And John, Liam, tell me if I got that part right. So DLL can make changes, but BEST sort of is the backstopping enterprise-wide for the application.
That's correct.
That's correct.
All right. And then Axway, so it can be configured to encrypt data in two phases. In transit, so while the data is being sent from point A to point B, and at rest while the data is on the servers. And so my understanding, the in transit mode is quick, but breaches occur while data is in transit often, and so it's significant to have the encryption in transit, and the data is at rest when it's on the server, sort of before and after the transfer is complete. My understanding, and I want to welcome someone to give me more sense, that in the at-rest mode can last for a little while in the current implementation. It's not instantaneous. Does that anyone want to, what's the sort of typical order of magnitude for the time that data remains at rest in the current framework?
This is Jan. I can weigh in if you want.
Yeah,
it can sit there for a while. It's supposed to be, I think ideally the process is that when you send a data file, you alert the person that the data file is there, and then they take it down, they remove it right away, and they take a copy of it, download it, and then they delete what's on the server. But the reality is that those files tend to sit there a lot longer than, I think we've gotten a little better, but they can sit there for a while.
I believe that there's a setting that the file goes away after 60 days.
Which is a long time.
Yeah.
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 And if that needs to be, changed, I'm sure that can be looked at.
No, this is Liam. The issue is usually that it's sitting there, let's say 3 to 5 days, and it's usually my fault in that there'd be a a study going on, and I'm expecting data to be matched from several participants, and until it's time for me to do the match, which means I have received the data from everybody, I don't really go looking for it. So that's certainly an action item that can make the process better as well. Me getting it off there as each one arrives rather than waiting for time to do the work. So it's that sort of thing. They might be sitting there a week.
Sure, and Liam, I don't mean this to be all on you. I think it happens between the agencies as we pass analytic data too. Yeah. So don't shoulder all of it.
No, just by volume, I know it's mostly me, but I'm doing all the matching.
Well, it's like to reemphasize Jan's point, like you should not shoulder all of it. That's why I wanted to put the role up at the beginning, is like it's the data governing board sort of responsibility. Our role, OPM, like we have to facilitate the data exchange and the whole data request management. So like it does fall on sort of all of us collectively to handle this. And that's why we want to make sure like people are aware, like here's how this works now, so that they understand the work that we're tasking folks to do through the system. But this is kind of how we implemented it. So this, again, hopefully I'm kind of describing the current state correctly. This is the application. The encryption can be in transit or at rest. The data does tend to stay at rest for, it's not instantaneous, a few days or possibly weeks in some cases. And it's any transfer between any of the different parties to this, it's the same thing, whether it's going to labor or between the participating agencies for analytic. And so then the reason for having this discussion is the last bullet point here, which came up again in like a separate meeting, doesn't have the full data governing board in it. But what our understanding is that the encryption for Axway is only enabled currently in transit. So while data is at rest, it's not encrypted. I want to make sure, like John, if I'm accurately describing that, that's the current state. So that's the current state, and this is the sort of status quo.
Yeah, there is, we had Axway take a look, and out of the 26 subscriptions that we currently have within Axway, 16 of which are using what is called repository encryption, which is the encryption at rest, and DOL is not included within those 16. So I think that obviously you're the board, but that is something that we can change and we can turn on for DOL. And Liam, if you want to add to any of that.
No, I think that sums it up just about exactly right.
Okay.
And so like this discussion, Katie, if you want to bring up the next slide, this discussion, the reason we're having this discussion is because it's an important topic. It's a good example. It's also, I think, a good example of where I don't think there's a lot of difficulty in making the decision here. So after kind of identifying this in some, side conversations, and we're very grateful to the folks at Labor, John, everyone, multiple people at DISBest for like jumping on this very quickly and having a lot of these discussions. The fairly straightforward recommendation, I think, is to do kind of exactly what John's describing, and then turn on the encryption, the repository encryption for data transit at rest. So like that's the proposal, the first bullet point here, the proposed sort of policy and procedure is data transmittal for all P20 when requests should encrypt data in transit and at rest. I think that's like a relatively uncontroversial change. It's I don't know if it's a straightforward change to make, but it's not an administratively like terribly difficult change to make. But if we're making changes to the system that all of the agencies are relying on, we want to make sure people understand, the nature of those changes before they're made. And so that's the reason for like calling the meeting, having the discussion, and going through like, how do we make a decision about this? So I don't anticipate that anyone would, object to this change. But if for some reason, you said this is something you're concerned with, or there's a downstream impact, or there was some implication that it made the process of, undertaking the transfers, more difficult, you had to log in, or certain people wouldn't have rights or something like that. We just want to make sure that like changes are made that have, impact on the system as a whole. Everybody who is part of the data governing board is fully like aware, briefed, and understands those before kind of any change is made. And so like, again, I think this is a relatively uncontroversial one, but we wanted to make sure like everybody understands like this is the change that we're proposing. It is this board's duty and responsibility to kind of like understand these changes and, that we're both there. So that's the proposed change. I think the steps that would have to be undertaken, DOL and BEST review what needs to be changed in the Axway implementation, which I think is largely already done. DOL or BEST, maybe I got this part wrong. Someone would have to actually implement the change and then just tell, data governing board when the changes are complete. We're in the middle, I think, as folks know, of going through revising the legal agreements, which will require changes to the documentation. So if there was something where there's a change in the data request management, like how you, made the transfers, or if you needed to turn on, an option, like OPM will update the documentation for that. If there were notices that had to go out to people that were in the midst of data transfers or something, like we can handle that aspect of the changes. So like making the change has some, downstream impact, in this case on DOL and OPM for, undertaking steps that are related to the change. And then the other thing that we've done for transparency, and I think this primarily or only at this point really impacts CSU and UConn, is we notified them that this is, a change we're proposing to make, gave both of them the option to put on, quote unquote, on hold some of the data requests where there's data that could be exchanged right now, to see if they want to wait until the change is complete or proceed with the status quo, which again is really like how the transfers have occurred up until today. So right now, this request is kind of on hold until we make the changes. I think the nature of the changes is hopefully somewhat uncontroversial and straightforward to make, but we want to make sure people understand what's being proposed, the changes that are being made, and steps needed to undertake that. And again, to the point earlier, like what it's taking for labor to do this, what it takes for OPM to do this, etc. In this case, not too bad. Does anyone have questions or on the proposed change? Like, so kind of what John and Liam talked about, what's laid out here. Does this make sense?
Scott, just one comment, if I could. The change would be made within the application, and then there's a timing factor where we would have to test it and verify it, and then also the timing of it, because it will impact, people will think that they have corrupt data. So if it's if we've enabled it and data is there, I don't remember the specific timing or the steps of it. We'll have to work that through with Axway, but there is a timing factor to make sure that this is accurate and does not cause any problems.
Okay, that's really helpful. That's also, again, like that's a reason for bringing this up. Yeah, go ahead, Liam. And Dan
this is Liam. What I remember from the meeting with Axway was that the hiccup there is that if one person has encryption turned on and the other one isn't on yet, that's when they'll appear to receive encrypted, corrupted data, which will just be them receiving the encrypted file that's not being unencrypted or decrypted. I think in the case of the nature of the way we do business with P20, we can be fairly confident that won't happen. Just to the point that we're actually holding up transmissions right now to wait for this to happen. So clearly we'll be in place and tested before anybody sends any more data.
Can you have your hand up? Although I think you don't anymore.
Well, sure. I was just going to ask what the actual timing would be. I think our agreements say that it's supposed to be encrypted in transit and at rest now. So, I mean, making this change is a no-brainer. I'm really glad we're doing it, and I appreciate your facilitating that very much. So, I was just wondering how long it would take. That's all. And also maybe a question, since CSCU is outside of the state sort of infrastructure, would we have to do anything extra to decrypt on our end, or do we have to turn something on our side?
So I think I do.
Okay.
The encryption happens. The encryption and decryption actually all happens on the Axway server. In that's where it will be. We're only talking about the at-rest encryption here, so it's only when the file is sitting there. The Axway server will actually decrypt it before it passes it off to the HTTPS, which is the in-transit encryption, which is already happening in an automatic fashion So no, there's nothing that has to happen on the client sides. This is all server side technology. In terms of how long it'll take, it's really just a setting change on all the accounts. My expectation is it's going to take me perhaps half a day just to make sure I get everybody done and make sure my lists are complete and everything. The actual quantity of work is quite small. It's just making sure I do every little piece of it. That's going to take a couple of minutes.
Oh, that's great. Thanks.
And John, maybe without like making you give a hard commitment, do you have a sense of like how long the testing time would take for this? Just sort of again, order of magnitude, maybe for the days, weeks, hours, minutes.
I think, after, and we would coordinate this and we'd make sure we'd have Axway in a loop as well, just to, have their guidance to make sure that if something does go wrong, that we have them quickly available. But I would think that would be within a day. Do you agree with that, Liam? After you make your changes, we can test it or verify it, because we can test in our testing environment.
I do. It'll be quick.
Yeah.
It's really a setting on an account, and then we're going to push some sample files around and make sure that they're encrypted, and that people who don't have the encryption setting set can't read them. I mean, that's the sum total of our testing.
Yeah. So probably within a day.
That is awesome. Thank you, guys.
Are there other questions on the proposed change? Again, like a reason for having discussion is to make sure folks kind of understand the nature of it, potential impact on your agency, potential impact on the system, et cetera. So like, these are kind of questions we want to make sure we can address. All right, hearing nothing. Oh, John, maybe you're going to say something.
No, I just, okay. No.
The next thing we need to do, I think, as the data governing board, is make a decision on this. And again, like, this is pretty uncontroversial. I think, like Jan said, this is actually part of the agreement that you have already. So the policy and procedure is already there. But we want to make sure, like, before we make changes to the system, that folks understand the nature of those changes, the downstream impact on everybody. You have a chance to ask and answer a question. So I think, like, this kind of is the segue into the discussion on the voting procedures. Like, do we want to vote on that? Is there general consensus? How do we determine that there's general consensus? There's, I think, questions. There's folks who could not make the meeting today. So this is just a good example. This is a decision, again, it's a fairly uncontroversial decision. So, like, I don't, and we don't have the policies and procedures for voting and those kinds of things laid out. So this is a good example of, like, where there's a decision that has to be made. I don't, again, anticipate any issue with it, but, do we make a decision with the people that are here? Do we, go with, I think consensus is the term that people have used, but I want to figure out how we determine that we've reached consensus. What's the way in which we want to move this forward. So I think we can sort of segue into that next section of the agenda, unless, again, like, this seems like a fairly uncontroversial change. We don't have policies and procedures for voting or making a decision on it, but it seems like we should be doing this. And unless someone raises an objection an hour later, we'll send the slides with the documentation to the folks that couldn't make the meeting in case they wanted to raise something. But I think we'll do what we can to make this change. And I'm really grateful also to particularly to John and Liam for jumping on this fairly quickly. This was somewhat unexpected that this is going to be an issue. It came up I think less than 2 weeks ago, and they were able to pull together, bring in the vendor, and be with them, understand kind of everything, and come back with a sort of proposed course of action. So this is I think particularly just a really helpful example of the collaboration they have. So that's, if we're going to segue into the voting procedures. Any other questions on the encryption? All right. So we may not have prepped folks fully for this. We had a sort of discussion that ran out of time on the voting procedures last time. And Jan, I don't know if you're willing to dig back into kind of where it left off, but I think we essentially just ran out of time and I think didn't come to full resolution. So I want to go back and see if there were topics that folks wanted to discuss from that or something that came up. And Jan, I'll sort of look to you particularly because I think you were the one who brought this to the table, and it was a rich discussion, and we just ran out of time, so we want to make sure there was a little additional time today to go through it if necessary. The encryption, I think, is a good example of like that's the kind of thing where some decision making is required for the board, and we want to figure out how we make those decisions.
Okay, I wasn't ready to talk about it, but we can certainly dive back in. I think the question is straightforward. If there's to be a change in our decision-making process, what should that be? I was just, I just pulled up the EMOU to try to see what it says right now, and I can't actually spot. Do you know where it is within the data governing board that we could look at the language that's there and think about it?
What we have in, I think the latest draft is basically a line that says that this board and the executive board will adopt bylaws and procedures, which would include voting. So there isn't anything, and because we didn't reach, I think full consensus last time, we put in kind of a placeholder that says, well, we'll do that. This board, the executive board, will go through and determine those procedures in the future. That's a responsibility for it. If we reach some consensus, then we could put in sort of like a concrete proposal at this point. But that was the takeaway from the last meeting. My takeaway from the last meeting.
Yeah, and that's an option. Go ahead, Rob.
Oh, Rob.
Hi, everybody. It's Rob. We've been talking a lot about the different voting procedures, and I think it's important to understand that you've been talking about interchanging two different things. I want you to understand that if you look at it specifically, there are differences between boards that make decisions because normally they use what's known as Robert's Rules of Order. I mean, most boards use Robert's Rules of Order, and consensus process is different. And then there's even a different process called dynamic facilitation. So there's three different ways of us looking at it. The most standard way of looking at voting on decisions by boards is actually Robert's Rules of Orders. And I might make a suggestion that we perhaps take a look at that and use that as a basis so that we have some kind of an idea for both us and the public if they were to come and ask how we make our decisions. It's based on a standard core of practices rather than just, us throwing out, well, we're going to do it by consensus or something like that. I think we should, use what the standards are for business practices. And I think Robert's Rules is a very good way of doing that. It provides some structure to that whole process that you're talking about.
And I would have to actually learn those rules, which I've so far avoided.
Well, I only know them because they're called Robert's Rules, and my name is Robert, so I'm just kidding.
That's
just a small little levity on a Friday morning there. But there are very definite rules around each, and you can look them up. And I mean, perhaps we should look into that a little bit and take a look at that and come up with a way that we should move forward in this regard.
I will affirm both points too. And like you can watch, there's a public meeting last year where I screwed up the voting procedure using Robert's Rules, and someone had to like correct me in it. So like I have not mastered it, but there's some value to it. I don't know. I think that this is a discussion we're going to have. Lloyd, you're unmuted. I don't know if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to support Robert's point. I think Robert's Rules of Orders provides a pretty good structure for voting and decision making, and decent enough structures to allow minority views to be heard, right, through the process. My only concern about voting is sort of whether or not minority views are heard. And by minority, I don't mean African Americans. I mean the dissenting voice, right? We want to make sure that the dissenting voice is given due deference. Their concerns are given due deference, right? Because of the way we're trying to do this, right? We have these independent participating members who, if they don't agree with something, they may simply pull away, right? So that's all I have. Thanks.
Ron, did you have something to say?
Sounds like that's a motion. Let's move it forward.
Well, it's got to be seconded, right, Ron?
That's right.
Right. I just threw up a link to a page that talks about the differences if you wanted to look at the differences between the three voting procedures and the way that, you know, people look at things. So just in case anyone wanted to know the comparison between the three, they are up there.
Yeah. I would say most members of the executive board will understand Robert's Rules of Orders intuitively. It's kind of at our level, at the governing level, that we probably need to brush up.
I think it's a great idea. What do other people think? We could either put that in, or we could say bylaws later and decide later. I don't have a strong feeling about it, other than just being clear about what it's going to be.
Just as long as there's a clear structure, right?
I agree with Robert's rules. I think that's a great idea.
And it'll be a learning opportunity for me. Not that I will be running it, but I really have avoided. I'm going to
ask.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, before I think someone needs to like make the motion to adopt the Robert's rules, and then we have to adopt them. So we're in the Schrodinger's cat situation where we don't have the.
I'll make the motion. I'll make a motion that we adopt. I'll make a motion. Okay.
The one thing I'm curious, like from being, a little ambivalent on the over making the meeting sort of more formal than it need to be, which I think we want to take away the collaborative culture that we have. I think are there ways in which it can be used, selectively to say like, all right, here's a decision that we have to make, and so that we're, like when we call the Robert's rules into play when there's a decision we need to make. But if there's, the open discussion about like we're going through updates, or there's a topic that folks want to discuss, that some of the discussions don't become overly formal, we're able to deploy them like in the situations where they're necessary. But I'm curious if that's.
Well, I think that with Robert's rules, you have an opportunity for discussion, and that's the whole point of the structure, is that when you make a motion, the motion has to be seconded, and then discussion takes place, and then it's actually voted on at the end. And so those would also be specific things that you put on the agenda. If you just wanted to have a general discussion, you could certainly have a general discussion, but the point at which we would actually make a decision, that's where the formal motion would come in. So I think there's an opportunity for both, given the situation. Just my opinion.
I think that's probably more fact than opinion, but thank you for sharing either way. So thanks, Rob, for bringing this up. I don't know that again, like we sort of have a consensus approach. There's a few people not in the meeting today. These are the kind of questions they're hoping to, think about, like how do we make decisions? And this is a, decision that seems like there's sort of general consensus on, but I feel like this is probably the direction to go in.
Yeah. Does anybody on the call have concerns about taking this up, since we haven't adopted them yet? This is just open discussion.
I wouldn't have any concerns whatsoever. I think it's very much appropriate way of conducting business. I've been doing it, for 14, 15 years. So it's never been an issue. So I would also be in full support of it.
And I appreciate Scott's comment to just the not adding in more formality, and being able to keep things comfortable. And I definitely appreciate that. So I'm encouraged, Rob, by your indicating that it could be both ways. We can have discussions, and then if we need to vote on something, then we can vote. Then we could bring it in. But let's just, for those people who's not on the call, I guess it's Ajit and just Ajit. I don't know.
No, Ajit, Rachel, and Susan from DSS.
And Susan.
Have we Have we created any
Jen on.
bylaws yet? I know we have MOUs, but have we created bylaws, Scott, at all? To talk about
Not
how
for
we
the
operate?
boards. No, not for these groups. To my knowledge, I may stand corrected if someone.
I mean, that might be something that we want to look at too, you know, just so that we have a frame of reference. And usually, you know, you can develop your bylaws to have a lot of flexibility to allow discussion and a lot of it within, you know, how you make your decisions. So, I mean, that's also part of, you know, what goes into the whole process.
And I think that's what you said, Scott, was being put into the agreements. You know, it might make sense to just leave it that way for the agreements, and then somebody could follow up with Ajit and Rachel and Susan, and maybe that could be the beginning of the bylaws.
Yeah, the only real question that I have with regards to Robert's rules is with regards to minutes. Will we be having minutes of the meetings, or is it just the tape recording of our meetings? Where it gets a little funky sometimes is, you know, you have your discussion points, you know, and then you're taking minutes, and then well, I didn't really mean to say that, or that wasn't my intent. So that's the only real question that I have with regards to, you know, formalizing, and what if we are going to do minutes, what would be the process?
So I actually do take minutes / notes for every meeting. And I've actually taken notes for a number of different boards that had varying interpretations of how detailed they need to be, from like saying, you know, 3 people discussed this and like leaving it at that, or saying Rom said this, Jan said that, Lloyd said this, and like, but no vote was needed. But, or saying just in general, there was discussion about the voting procedure. So it's really up to you as a board how detailed you want it to be. I generally just kind of summarize the topic, and I don't necessarily like identify who said what unless it's like pertinent to the decision that's being made. Lloyd?
Yeah, I think it's a legitimate concern. I think the process usually, though, with minutes is at whatever level detail you decide to take minutes, they get shared with the group, and then the group gets to sort of approve or recommend edits to the minutes, right, before they are sort of promulgated, you know, in perpetuity.
Yes.
So
Right,
it
so at
gives
the
us a
next
chance, Rom, to, you know, to eliminate all this sort of inappropriate comments, if you will.
I think
You
in
know,
terms
for the public record.
in terms of Robert's rules, the minutes really just need to contain a record of what was done at the meeting, not what was said. So
Fair point. Very good.
You also can always design your bylaws so that there's something that's called executive session. And if you go into an executive session, then that information doesn't necessarily need to be shared with the public. I mean, it's just something to keep in mind, you know, as a way of if we wanted to have a discussion about something, you know, that is touchy, or, you know, that we didn't want to have out there in public record.
So, for what it's worth, I agree with Robert. That's correct. You know, it gets a little touchy because I know we can get real formalized with this process. You know, we have at UConn started at our Board of Trustees meetings citing statute before we go into executive session. So, you know, I don't know if we'll be held to that kind of standard or not, but you would have to. I don't know who from the state had pushed us to do that, or if it was just our own lawyers, but beware, it could get that arcane.
Wow.
Yeah, Lloyd is absolutely accurate on those issues. You know, you definitely have to, you know, notice that you're going to executive session so that the public is aware that the things that are discussing is, you know, something that it's not for public at this time. And then the things that you discuss in executive session stay in executive session, or should stay in executive session. So that is another matter as well.
Yeah, executive session though is really about the FOI law, not really about Robert's rules. Just to
Good point.
throw that in there.
That's very true, Patrick. Yep.
Yeah, I think we were just discussing the point of how, technical, we could get.
So for now, it seems like people are moving in this direction. Do you have what you need, Scott? I know there's one more item on the agenda. It's probably a big one. So I want to make sure we have some time for that too. And I turn facilitation back. I wasn't really facilitating this, but I'll turn what you pointed in my direction back to you.
Yeah, thank you I'm sorry for putting you on the spot about this, but I think we realized we ran out of time for this last time. I think, again, sort of reading the room and acknowledging there's a couple people not here, and maybe people want to like think about it afterwards. Probably the approach we have in the legal agreements now in the drafts where it says like we'll adopt, bylaws and procedures. That's probably the right way to do it. And then to dig into that, we can form a subcommittee, budding parliamentarians to go through and do this and draft something. But I think that sounds like the right resolution. So, and we do have one more topic, so I will bump it back to Katie, who has very capably and ably done what I think are wonderful notes. It is not something that everybody does a great job with, but she has been, keeping up with the notes so that we meet the public meeting laws, and like it's just a kind of the way Maura described it. Like this is what happened at the meetings. That's below by the law.
Okay, so I will share another slide deck. So this is what we have proposed for the executive board meeting that's happening on next Wednesday. So I just wanted to review the agenda and the slides that we are planning to share and just get feedback if you have any. But this agenda has been approved by Commissioner Bai, but because the Data Governing Board recommends to the Executive Board, we wanted to make sure that you had a chance to review this and provide some feedback, because we do have time to make changes if we need to.
Can I ask a question before we get into this? So we just voted that we're going to on a voting procedure. Do we actually vote on the encryption issue? Do we need to?
Just 2 cents on mine. It's already in our procedures that we're supposed to be encrypting at transit and rest. I don't know if it's something that.
Okay, that's fine. Then
that's fine. Perspective.
We'll proceed on encrypting then. Perfect.
Yeah, I think for that reason and the fact that we haven't fully adopted the procedures, that seemed right. But it was a good example to go through. Oh, sorry. I was going to say for transparency too, Commissioner Bai sort of kind of guided this is the agenda that she wants. We put together the slides, but the slides, she hasn't seen the slides yet, I don't think. Correct, Katie, correct me.
She is not.
Wrong about that. All right, so we were hoping to get folks to review them. We can send the PowerPoint out after this and get edits or comments to before sending her the actual slides. But these are the topics and the agenda she wanted to cover.
Okay, so pretty straightforward for public comment and attendance. So system updates. Is it showing you those slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. For whatever reason, it froze on my end for a second. Okay, so system updates are really similar to what we present at the Data Governing Board meetings with you all. So this is the calendar that we've been keeping up to date. It probably needs some editing, but again, if you know that there are data requests coming in, please let us know so that we can keep this as up to date as possible. Which would lead us to the enterprise agreements, which we are still hoping will be ready for signature. But if not, at least we can, we have an opportunity for the commissioners to comment on what the agreements are. So we've included the summary slides that I've been putting together for the EMOU. We will cover the contents of both documents at the meeting. And I don't know, Scott, if you have anything you want to add about the agreements.
No, I think the one thing from the prep with Commissioner Bai and Rachel, I think it's not here, and she was in the discussion with her. She was very enthusiastic about kind of bringing this forward and having, something akin to sort of a signing ceremony or way to recognize this and to bring on the new agencies. So whatever we're able to do on Wednesday, our hope is that we're able to get at or very close to signature. But whatever we get to, I think, she just felt like this is like a real watershed moment. And I think particularly she wanted to cover some of the things in the next agenda because of the way that OEC has worked very closely with DCF, Department of Children and Families, DFS, and some of the other agencies in the past month or two on sort of the Recovery Act plans. So just to give you sort of the color for the discussion, she's very enthusiastic about this moving forward. And I think particularly for the agencies that have been sort of in the waiting room for a little while, she's really excited to be able to work with those agencies, which is great.
Yes, I guess I should have also started by saying that this will be the first official executive board meeting with all 10 agencies present and participating, which is really exciting. So this will be the icing on the cake. So the next section is about system sustainability. So this is an opportunity. Commissioner Bai was going to talk about the different ARPA funds that were available and how she, along with the commissioners at DSS and DPH, have really focused on making data sharing a priority. And then I'm going to let Scott talk about the cost sharing policy.
So we thought this is kind of a twofer, sort of based on the guidance from Commissioner Bai talking about the ARPA plan as particularly one opportunity for support for the kind of efforts that are similar to P20 win in the state, and then second, related to that was sort of the more general topic about system sustainability, which is part of the executive board's focus. And so I think a couple of folks have brought up the existing cost sharing policies that we have. So we have a slide here that just sort of attempts to lay out what's in that cost sharing policy about the kind of in-kind costs that are borne by the participating agencies and the dedicated costs that are cost to the system. And so we wanted to make sure the executive board is kind of, because there's new people on it since this was adopted, that are sort of aware of that framework that's in the existing policy. The language here, I think, summarizes a little bit what's in the existing policy. And then the next slide.
So, Scott?
Yeah. What?
Can we go back to the previous slide? So the column on the right, these costs, you're making a distinction between in-kind costs and dedicated costs. Does that mean that we're going to have some kind of mechanism to share the dedicated costs?
So, and maybe Jan can correct me on this. This is the existing cost sharing policy for the board. And I think as I understand it, and it could be wrong about it, the cost sharing policy just identifies the cost. It doesn't propose a mechanism for sharing. So it just says like, these are the in-kind costs that the expectation is, you'll sort of bear these. And then these are the things that are dedicated costs. And it doesn't propose like a mechanism for sharing them. So I don't know, Jan, is that accurate?
Well, there's two parts to it. When we began, part of it was helping the agencies who were involved when we had no funding of any type understand that they needed to be doing things in kind to support the system, and also allowing for, if we were to get a grant or if we were to get funding from the state, which we were actively pursuing at that time, how it might be used. That money never happened. But we also, the part to this policy, which was developed secondly to this little piece right here, is the fee structure, which is important. I think that is the source of funding that we have right now, outside of the grant money. And there is a little pool for it. There's probably enough to send somebody to a conference, So I don't know, if you're going to talk about the cost sharing policy, I would just hope you would include that other part of it, you know, and if you're wanting to do away with that part of it, then raise that maybe.
Okay.
Because that gives money back to the agencies. You know, it gives money to DOL, it gives money to OPM, it gives money to the agencies, not much, but a little bit.
So
Yeah, okay, all right.
One of the reasons why UConn is eager to do things, or at least I am eager to do things in kind, is so I don't have to sort of pay for activities, right? So it's sort of a informal quid pro quo, I guess. And I would imagine any agency would have a concern about an explicit sharing where funds change hands.
Yeah, someone, again, who, you know, has been around for longer and correct me, but my understanding is this policy does not propose a cost sharing mechanism. It's called the cost sharing policy. Maybe it's a better way of, like, there's a better way of naming it here. And the cost sharing policy, like Jan says, it covers the fee policy as well as identification of the cost, but there's no proposal for cost sharing in it, or that's being, you know, brought to the board.
That's fine. That's fine. Just wanted clarity. Thanks.
I don't know, but if I'm wrong about that, someone should definitely say so, but that was my read of it. All right, and the next we went through the dedicated costs and just sort of like itemize these to like a rough, you know, ballpark, and then some of the sources that are funding these currently. And I think Jan, to your edit, like this doesn't cover the fees, so that's a good call out. We have, so these are the same costs that are on the previous slide. There's costs for data matching software, staff time at Data Integration Hub for matching, staff time to operating group for administration, analytical support for the agencies to participate, marketing, communications, conference travel, system costs, sort of other costs unspecified. And then we have dollar figures for a few of these. So we just got, Labor just got sort of an estimate for costs for keeping data ladder for 3 years, which is $25,000, which we should be able to fund through the SLDS grant. Travel to SLDS conferences is funded through the SLDS grant over 3 years. So we have funding sources to cover some of the dedicated costs. And I think a reason, you know, Commissioner Bryce sort of wanted to bring this up is that OEC particularly has been like a leader in working with some of the federal funds they have to make sure that they provide system support, federal and private dollars, I think, to make sure that they provide system support. And so we listed out some of the potential funding sources here on the right for the staff time for data integration for operating group. And then the next slide goes through some things where there's agency level grants that potentially support you know, agency work on specific projects. So I attempted to list out, and we'll send this around so you can correct me if I got some of this wrong, federal, private, or state budgeted funds that are going to some of the individual agencies that have a data sharing component to them. So the SLDS grant is the one grant that is like solely dedicated to P20, but there are other grants that are either pending, for which there's proposals out, or that are, you know, sort of funds in hand that have data sharing as a component. And again, I know Rachel's not here, but PDG is the grant that OEC has to support a very wide range of their activities and has a component for data sharing. I think OEC has said, you know, some of this we want to make sure is supportive of P21. So this is a model that other states use to support SLDSs, is you know, patching together and leveraging different sources of federal funds that support that to make sure that the agencies and the system as a whole kind of have support. But there's no, I think, Lloyd, to your question, there's no sort of explicit cost sharing, but we want to identify, you know, there's resources that are that's out there. There's state is, you know, actively pursuing, you know, different grants that support data sharing. It doesn't include the ARPA funds. It doesn't include potential funds through the Office of Workforce Strategy. So there's other funds that could, you know, support data sharing through P20 Win. And this is just a list of some of those that are out there, so folks are aware that we're trying to make sure that we've got the support for the system and the agencies that are part of it. Lloyd.
You mentioned ARPA funds. Have we already been allocated ARPA funds, or is that just a potential pot of funds?
That's potential. It's not. There's nothing.
Okay.
I don't think anybody's
Right.
been allocated anything, and this
I
is
know
where
there's
we're
a
going
lot
to
of
take
money.
this.
Okay.
There's a lot
I
of
know
money.
it's a huge part. Yeah.
Commissioner Bai, I think Commissioner Bai, particularly like with DCF, DSS, and I think to some extent K-12 has really like put together sort of a vision for that, and she wanted to discuss that sort of the outset.
Fair enough. Thanks.
Oh, Rob, you have your hand. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to, well, let me take my hand down first. How's that? I just wanted to point out that very often, you know, at the Labor Department or other places where we apply for grants, federal grants, and then we're awarded federal grants. Like I'll give an example. We were awarded a National Dislocated Worker Opioid Grant. All of these grants that we take always have some component of them that require data analysis or that kind of information when we complete it. So I just wanted to point that out that, you know, as part of that, we might get, you know, requests like that once we take on those grants to have P20 Win conduct whatever kind of surveys or studies or data analysis that the grantor wants us to do. You know, the federal government usually requires that as part of it.
Yeah,
So,
and I think this is like the, I don't know, sort of like major grants that have like a substantial portion dedicated to data sharing. Some of them are, you know, grants that are solely focused on, you know, interagency sort of data. So WTQI is an example of that. But there's other grants, and this is how other, you know, SLDS, integrated data systems in other states are funded, is by, you know, leveraging portions of the, you know, the grant to say like, oh, okay, well, you're going to do the, you know, the evaluation, the study of this thing, and we're going to, you know, use the SLDS to do that. So yeah, that this is kind of the high level, but what we're hoping, I think, for the board discussion is to just dig in to get exactly those kinds of examples to it. So like that's perfect. I know we're at 9:30. Sorry. Some folks are going to drop.
So yeah, I know that we're at time, but really quickly, we included the Resident Advisory Board, which is what we are hoping will allow us to address and review different requests to, you know, make sure that they are equitable and not impacting families and residents in an adverse way. I know that it's been discussed a lot with regard to the EMOU and the data sharing request form, but we have it's not a unique project. We have a number of different groups in the state at different state agencies that have comparable groups that engage community members. And so we just wanted to make sure that we addressed that. Scott, I don't know if you have anything to add. Again, I know we're at time.
No, I think Commissioner Bai thought this is a good example to just talk through what some of the agencies are doing, because again, it's particularly a lot of the, not a lot of, but some of the new agencies, you know, have put some time into these kinds of efforts. And so just have them talk through it. So I think we're sharing the information about, you know, what's being done already.
I'll be real quick, if I may.
Sure.
I just want to say I think it's really awesome that we're going to have all 10 agencies, you know, at the executive board meeting, and hats off to you guys for keeping people on and bringing everybody to this stage. It's really, really awesome. And I understand the importance of marking this as a watershed moment and wanting to have, you know, some sort of official designation of that. I know that from our meeting yesterday, there was still a lot of movement with the agreements. If it makes sense to draft something, you know, in advance, like we recognize this is this moment, we welcome these agencies into this collaboration, you know, something along those lines. We, you know, we'll continue to work on these things. We agree to that, whatever it might be. I think that's awesome. I would just hope that that language could be floated first, so that when we get there, you don't have anybody like, I don't know if I can sign this, but they're ready, and we can have that wonderful watershed moment. Just a thought. again, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I think we're anticipating all possible outcomes on Wednesday. So, that's it. Katie.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. I appreciate you guys making time again this morning. And I will see you guys later. Have a great weekend.
Happy
I guess
Friday.